Welcome to the podcast. I'm Angela Bobier, and this is Life in the Talbot Settlement, brought to you by Tyrconnell Heritage Society and Backus-Page House Museum. In this series, we will do our best to give you a full appreciation of the history of Western Elgin County in southwestern Ontario, from First Nations through the original European settlers to the 1950s. I'll cover one topic per episode, with the first 8 setting the tone for who we are, where we are, and what we do here at Backus-Page House Museum. Please follow us on all social media by searching at Backus-Page House, spelt BACKUSPAGEHOUSE. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Welcome to the 20th episode of our podcast, Life in the Talbot Settlement. Today we will be talking about a plant that was very important to the Talbot Settlement and all of Canada as a whole. The tobacco industry has provided many jobs and a strong economy for the settlement for countless years. You may have noticed while driving in Elgin County, miniature barns in the middle of fields. These mini barns are called kilns, and the fields in which they sit are tobacco fields. Continue listening to learn more. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage and Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum. The cultivation of tobacco has been in Canada for over 1,000 years and was likely the earliest form of agriculture in North America, long before crops such as corn, beans, and squash. The plant was unknown to the rest of the world until Europeans saw it in the Americas. Indigenous people utilized tobacco in many different aspects of life, for example, birthing ceremonies, courtships, marriage, death, and personal prayer. Natural tobacco has been an integral part of Indigenous culture across Canada for hundreds of years, probably longer. The smoke from sacred tobacco is believed to be the pathway to the spirit world, carrying thoughts, feelings, and prayers to the Creator. It is sometimes thrown in a fire, but it is more commonly made into a hand-rolled cigar, cigarette, bundle, or pipe. Often it is not smoked, and when it is not inhaled into the lungs. Tobacco was also used when hunting before and after a kill. It is presented with the left hand, as it is closest to the heart, and spread on the ground or on water as an offering to the earth to ask for safe passage and a request for guidance. This practice gives thanks to the Creator and the animal. More specifically, in southwestern Ontario, tobacco was cultivated by the Attawandaron and Huron nations. These groups then introduced it to the Europeans, and it was soon after an important item of trade. The crop was grown abundantly by the Pétan and Neutral nations, and I am so sorry if I am saying that incorrectly. They produced such a profusion of crop, they traded the plant with the northern nations for furs. Since we know the Huron had knowledge of transplanting pumpkin seeds, there is reason to believe the Hurons and Attawandaron used the same method to sprout tobacco seeds. They may have even built primitive greenhouses to do so. These nations cleared land by burning and planting their crops of tobacco and corn between charred stumps in the fields. In time, when the Europeans came and disrupted the lands, First Nations were forced from their homelands and lost control of their tobacco fields. Indigenous peoples were demanded to move to reserves and were stripped of their cultural practices. This caused the cultivation and consumption of sacred tobacco to plummet. Due to the Indian Act of 1895, nations were not allowed to sell the tobacco, commanding it illegal for Indigenous peoples to sell products from their farms. This act drove the ceremonial practice underground. It is important here to note traditional tobacco use is not to be confused with recreational smoking. Tobacco is part of the nightshade family. Several food crops belonging to the nightshade family are potatoes, tomatoes, and eggplants. To get a better understanding of tobacco, let's discuss the processes of growing the plant. The seeds of tobacco are sown in sterile muck in greenhouses during the first week of April. By late May or early June, the seedlings are then transplanted to the fields. The average height the plants are topped off at is 16 to 19 leaves in late July. The average leaf is 23 to 30 centimeters wide and 55 to 60 centimeters in length. The leaves start maturing from the bottom upwards and are harvested in batches of 2 to 3 leaves per harvesting or priming a week apart. The cultivated leaves were tied on slats with strings by tyers, a job usually done by women. When the leaves reach the kiln, they are taken out and placed on a narrow table. 2 handlers pass about 2 to 3 leaves to the tyer, who loops them on each side of a tobacco slat held on a tying stand or horse. Once the slat is filled, it is placed on a conveyor into the kiln where it is then hung. Kilns or curing barns are typically 22 feet by 24 feet wide and about 14 to 16 feet high at the eaves. The interior of a kiln is a network of poles or hangers spread apart to load the tobacco slats. A standard kiln will hold about 1,200 sticks, each stick holding about 90 leaves. Gas or propane furnaces can be seen on the outside of some kilns and are used for flue-cured leaves. Air-cured tobacco is commonly cut by the stalk and hung on sticks to dry naturally. The final product after this process of drying is a brown color. Before the invention of the furnaces, tobacco farmers would light a fire in the center of the curing barns to speed up the drying process. The curing process leaves the leaves a golden brown color. The final product after this process of drying is just brown. Once the leaves are fully dried, which is determined by checking the stems as they are the last part of the plant to dry, the fires are shut off and the leaves are allowed to cool down. The doors of the curing barns are often open to allow moist air to soften the leaves. The average farm has 1 kiln for every 5 or 6 acres of fields. This means that the kilns must be properly emptied and refilled until the crop is harvested. During the end of harvest, once the last leaves are arranged in the kiln, the harvesters get together and throw a celebratory party for the final night, usually having a bonfire, drinks, and music. It was not until the year 1800 that tobacco was commercially produced in the counties of Kent and Essex. In the early 19th century, money was sparse and much of settlers' produce was bartered. Tobacco was cultivated to try and strengthen the cash income. In 1854, tobacco from the United States was allowed to enter Canada for the first time. Virginia, North Carolina, and Mississippi are some of the leading tobacco states that make up the U.S. Tobacco Belt, a name given due to an area with a large quantity of tobacco farms and warehouses. This action of importing caused Ontario's production of the crop to virtually cease due to the product being duty-free. The American Civil War interrupted the production rates in the U.S. Tobacco Belt and led to an increased production in southwestern Ontario. Canadian tobacco was shipped down the Mississippi River to New Orleans during this time. Subsequently, as the Civil War in the States came to an end in 1865, the output of tobacco in Ontario dropped again as the U.S. resumed regular production levels. In 1870, production was approximately 400,000 pounds. 10 years later, however, it dropped to only 160,000 pounds. In the census of 1870 and 71, it stated that the production of tobacco in all of Canada was just under 1.6 million pounds, just under 400,000 pounds of which was grown in Ontario, and almost 1.2 produced in Quebec. Until around 1920, burley tobacco was the primary grown type in North America. Flue-cured tobacco was introduced in Ontario in the early 1900s, and today is the main type grown in Canada, making up 95 to 98% of tobacco, 90% of which is grown in southwestern Ontario. Burley, an air-cured leaf, slowly fizzled out as the First World War came around. Soldiers popularizing cigarette smoking gave rise to the cultivation of the Virginia or bright leaf, a flue-cured type of tobacco. The increase of cigarettes put a high demand on the new tobacco type that could be mechanically assembled. The United States developed a machine that rolled and packaged cigarettes in sealed packages. This fad quickly caught on in Canada. A new system had also been discovered in the southern United States that turned dark air-cured leaf to a golden brown. This revolutionized the Canadian tobacco industry, and Virginia leaf production rose. The Virginia leaf was not air-cured, but rather flue-cured and used ducts to conduct heat from a furnace to the leaves during the curing process. This meant soil conditions that were previously deemed almost worthless in southwestern Ontario were ideal for production and became some of the highest priced soil in the region. This region was the perfect soil to grow bright-leaf tobacco, as the soil consists of 4 layers: fine gray-brown sand, yellow golden brown sand, brown sticky sand, and silt and clay. This ensures that the soil will warm up in early spring, hold nutrients and water, while staying well drained. Due to Lake Erie, the climate stays mild, little chance of frost after the first week of May, and staying held off until near the end of September allows for perfect growing conditions. Essex and Kent had been the center of commercial tobacco growing since 1800. The sand plain along Lake Erie continued to produce air-cured leaf, including in Elgin County. In 1959, the Ontario Flue-Cured Tobacco Growers Marketing Board was established. Soon after, they built 3 warehouses in Tillsonburg, Delhi, and Elmer. At these warehouses, tobacco could be auctioned off to buyers. The Dutch clock system was used to replace the old system of selling tobacco straight from the farms. By 1971, Alderboro Township had 215 tobacco farms, which produced 3,100 acres of tobacco crops. Canada is among the 12 highest-ranking tobacco-producing countries and grows 5 major types: flue-cured, for example, Virginia leaf, and air-cured, including burley, cigar, dark, and pipe leaves. The first tobacco to be exported was probably from New France, now Canada, and was carried in dunnage bags on Cartier's ships. You probably remember hearing about Jacques Cartier in school. Later, it would be exported by explorers and fur traders from Upper Canada during the 1500s. There is no commercial record of the exporting of tobacco by the early settlers, though it is likely to have been transported. With the introduction of flue-cured tobacco, Canada became less reliant on imports, and by 1931 it was exporting the leaves in large quantities. From 1934 to 1938, the exports amounted to an annual average of 6.9 million pounds, 6.8 million of which was exported to the UK. Since then, the amount has gradually increased. In 1955, Canada stood 4th among the world's tobacco exporting countries. Thank you for listening to this week's episode on the tobacco industry. If you have photographs or documents about tobacco farming in Southold, Dunwich, or Alderboro Townships in Elgin County, we would be interested in learning more at Backus-Page House Museum. Also, we are not encouraging anyone to take up tobacco use for recreational purposes. Please tune in next week for a very festive episode, Christmas in the 1850s. Please share the podcast with your friends and follow us on all social media platforms at Backus-Page House. The Backus-Page House Museum and Tyrconnell Heritage Society acknowledges the land we are on today as the traditional territory of First Nations people, the Attawandaron, and the Iroquois. As settlers at a settler-focused museum, we value both the significant historical and contemporary contributions of all original peoples and ask how we can be supportive in Indigenous cultural renewal. Life in the Talbot Settlement is a production of Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum, funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage. Your host has been Angela Bobier. Music provided by Jack Witmer. Thanks to our producer, Katlyn Reintsma. To make a charitable donation and to contact the Backus-Page House Museum, visit our website www.backuspagehouse.ca. And thank you for listening.